Today I would like to discuss briefly a comparison between Baudrillard, the French thinker and philosopher, and Al Niffari. The comparison will affect only two topics, actually, or two themes. For Baudrillard, it's the simulacra, as we know. For who know about Baudrillard, the simulacra is extremely important. And for Al Niffari, it's the concept or the notion of the veil. So I would like to start by saying that the simulacra really depicts or represents something that over time disappears or is no longer there. However, the simulacra, that presentation, remains, and over time that representation becomes a representation of no original, or an original that doesn't exist anymore, or it disappeared. Which is an extremely important, really, I mean, when we talk about icons and religion, it is really important about what those icons or even statues for polytheism represent. Islam, of course, went after statues of all kinds, and iconoclasts went after pictures and icons. And it is actually interesting, like, I know people in the past and even now say, no, those icons and those statues do not represent the real God. They are just a representation that we use to get us in contact, or to give us an impression or an idea of what is the real thing. But Baudrillard went after that concept. Al Niffari, on the other hand, did not use the idea of a depiction or representation, and we know why. First of all, Al Niffari comes from an Islamic tradition. In other words, there is no depiction. We don't have in Islam any depiction of Allah or of any other, even Muhammad. We cannot represent him or depict him. We cannot do that for the angel either. So really the idea of icons is not valid in our basically imagination or concepts or conception of representations, because we cannot start from nothing, since we cannot represent God, we cannot represent the angels, the prophets, nothing. So we cannot really have representation. However, a lot of hadith, and then basically Niffari and Ibn Sab'in and a lot of Sufis and Ibn Arabi, of course, moved with the idea of the veil. There is, I mean, there are many hadiths supposedly from the Prophet saying that between God and earth or mankind there is 70,000 veils. Also that people are really asleep or dead until the veil is pulled. And then when Muhammad supposedly was asked, when is this, or what is this veil, and he said death, or when you die. In other words, we leave behind the veil, and once we die, the veil is lifted. And that is kind of interesting in the sense that we have an idea or the impression that there is a veil. The veil covers or separates two things from each other. What are those two things? That is extremely important to discuss, and to what I will be trying actually to discuss in this video. My impression is there is nothing hidden, and the veil really becomes itself the truth. It is really the search of any Sufi should be toward that veil, not what is behind the veil. Because in reality there is nothing behind that veil. And Niffari in one of the sections says that the word or the letter is a veil, and the veil is a letter. So here we have some kind of a catch-22 or a vicious circle, but not so, because when we think closely to the option that this saying give us or tell us, is that if the word is a veil, which we understand, so the word veils truth and many things, but then Al Niffari goes back and said the veil itself is a letter or a word. If we want to understand this, we can say that really the letter veils itself, or the veil veils itself, which is extremely important to us, because if the veil veils itself, we need to consider or try to understand a room or even a universe made of veils, one after the other. So once we lift the veil, there is another veil behind it. And we go back to that supposedly saying attributed to Muhammad, where he said, like, there is between God and mankind 70,000 veils. I mean, in this case, yes, everything is a veil. Words are a veil. Talking, anything else could be a veil, and we are living surrounded by veils, and everything is a veil. Now, of course, the question remains for Sufi that after the veil or behind the veil, there is the absolute truth. Is there one or not? And even if there is one, can we really understand it as an entity separate from the other things? So let's go back to the main original story here. The original story in Islam is that God breathed life into Adam, or exhaled, and we know very well that he cannot exhale or breathe life outside of himself, since he's everywhere. In other words, God breathed inside himself. Adam will be, I mean, basically the perfect man, and that's what we go where, if we ever discuss later the perfect man as understood by Ibn Arabi and later on by other Sufis. The perfect man starts with Adam and is Muhammad too, but it starts with Adam because the breath of Allah stayed within. Therefore, that breath, that drop of breath, if we can say, includes or contains everything from God. It contains all of his attributes. Now, we should understand here we are in an environment, a religious environment, as we can kind of approach it. There is nothing outside of God, so God is everywhere and everything. So when he breathes, he can only breathe inside himself. Now, here what we are, how we are going to discuss this. If we are all within God, the veil becomes a veil between God and himself, in other words. So, lifting the veil, really, there is nothing behind it. It's us, it's still us or God or whoever we are talking about. And Niffari doesn't talk a lot about fana or extension before God. The other definitely talk about that. Ibn Sab'in, Ibn Arabi, Al-Hallaj, all of them really talk about the fana and the extension. Bayzid al-Bistami also. But Niffari doesn't mention the idea, or barely mention the idea of the fana or the extension before God, which is understandable if we follow his logic. I mean, if we can say it's a logic, but anyway, within a religious framework, yes, it is a logic. If we follow that logic, yes, there is nothing behind the veil. The veil itself is the truth. There is nothing else. So, all of our search, all of our attempts to achieve something or complete something is basically to get to ourselves, because we are separated from ourselves by the veil. And this veil could take many forms, the form of letters, words, concepts, expressions, even what we consider a truth itself. And here, Al Niffari make really a diversion from almost all of the other Sufi by saying that, and I have a small problem here with the translation, but he said that reality is an attribute of the truth, and I am the truth. This is supposedly Al Niffari conversing with God, and this is what God told him. The wording itself is الحقيقة وصف الحق وأنا الحق. Now here, if we are going with the idea that the truth is Allah, I mean, we have in John also Jesus said he's the truth. Al-Hallaj said I am the truth, and being the truth is basically, the truth is also one of the name of Allah, or one of his attribute if we want. And here it is a description. So the truth is not an entity, is not something that we achieve or we get to. The truth becomes an attribute or a description kind of God himself. And if reality is a description of an attribute, therefore, we are not looking for an entity behind the veil. We are not looking for Allah supposedly behind the veil. We are talking about description. When we talk about description, and the word wasf, as used by Al Niffari, is always associated with a human being describing something else. It's not God who describes things. We understand that because when you describe, you give shapes, you give kind of many things that are humans, and once you get to that point, it becomes difficult to attribute that quality to God. So he's not a describer. He doesn't describe. God doesn't describe, because by describing we limit things. We give them shapes, we give them a momentum. Actually, we put them in time and space. Therefore, they lose their strength. So God doesn't describe people, but people or human describe God. And here in this situation, yes, we have a confusion or a correspondence between many things. We don't know whether whether Niffari was confused or really he meant it. But reality is an attribute of truth, and I am the truth. The word in Arabic is الحقيقة وصف الحق وأنا الحق. Now, here, as I said, since we enter a realm of description or a descriptive word, we are describing what's behind the veil. We can call that the truth, Allah, whatever it is, but we are describing it. By describing it, first of all, we are not talking about an entity. Therefore, behind the veil is not really God. It's a description. And since the description is made only by humans, we are really looking for ourselves behind the veil, because we are using some quality that only us can use and, I mean, kind of manipulate when we describe things. So, here, Al Niffari put us in a new position. First of all, truth is not an entity anymore, is not God anymore, it's a descriptive state. Truth will become, in this case, a quality of humans. We do create truth. This is one thing. The second thing, which is very important, is that we are not talking about an entity. God as an entity, whether he exists or not, I don't believe there is such an idea myself or concept or anything like that, but I believe that the humans believed in this entity. And most Sufis basically oriented their activity toward an entity. Of course, they end by destroying this entity. I mean, they did what Nietzsche did later by killing God. The Sufis did it before that, a long time before that. But they call it in a different way. They call it extension before God. And what they meant by that is that you get into a state of love, all of a sudden you feel within and inside God, and by then you become God itself. Now we do have really a serious, simple question: who is left there, or who is who in this situation? Once a human being is extant in God, is it God left there, or is the human being who took really the impersonated God? In other words, we really kill God by being him, or her if we want. So this what I was saying is that the next option that, or concept that Al Niffari added here to this game, is that truth is not God, is a descriptive state, first of all, and there is no entity behind it. So I am the truth being said by Jesus or Al-Hallaj means nothing in this kind of philosophy that is put together by Al Niffari, where the truth, as I said, becomes a descriptive state, which is a human quality and attribute. We can do description, we can describe things, only us can do that. Here even, God really becomes, as I said, a descriptive state for Al Niffari, and Al Niffari now can really play again with the idea of the veil. So along the al-mawaqif wal-mukhatabat, at many levels, Al Niffari say and repeats that this is a veil, this is a veil. When he talks about the truth, when he talks about words, letters, expressions, visions, everything almost becomes a veil. And we have, as I said earlier, we end up with a universe made of veils only, where there is nothing behind them. And this is what we need to understand in this new world that Al Niffari is actually inaugurating or launching with his approach to ideology, or approach to religion, is that the world is made of veils. And in this case, honestly, he himself, which he didn't say, but he himself, or any human being, become a veil too. And we are a veil to other, we are veiling other things, but we are ourselves a veil. And the biggest veil that there is between us and the rest of the world is, according to some tradition, again ascribed to Muhammad, death. Death is the main veil here, and by pulling it, or by dying, by the person dying, that's it. The man or the human being enter this new world of truth where there are no more veils. Now, my question here is, what is death veiling us from? Now, Al Niffari does not talk a lot about heaven and hell. Let's really get to a certain understanding of the idea of heaven and hell in Islam. You need to be rewarded for some of your action, and also for your bad action you need to be punished too. And that was the idea of heaven and hell. You need definitely a monotheistic kind of approach to religion, because you need one God actually to manage the whole deal. You cannot have a good functioning heaven and hell in a polytheist environment, because who's gonna run the show? You cannot really submit or delegate some of the activity to some of the angel or some of the other gods, and you do other gods. So heaven and hell requires basically a one God. It requires also a system where the punishment on earth is not very valid or not very strong. In other words, because you cannot really do a lot of things to people because either government, and I will discuss this later in other videos, if the government is not strong enough, if there is not a functioning kind of penitentiary system, etc., you probably better off creating an idea like hell, where people who you cannot punish down earth, you can punish them up there. And then a third really good reason to have a heaven and hell is like in Islam, where you have conquests. It was very difficult at the beginning to send people to their death without really giving them some extra promises. So you have one promise is that there is a loot, there is women, there is greenery, there is a lot of things that you can get, but still, a lot of those people knew that they were gonna die. And it was actually excellent at that time to create the idea of heaven and hell. So even if you don't make it here, if you don't win anything here, you didn't win the war, or you didn't win any kind of loot, you should be comforted by the idea that you will get a good reward in the other world. So the idea of heaven and hell, I think, had a very political and social and even economic connotation, more than anything else. So when it comes to Sufis, it wasn't really very well developed. It wasn't one of their concerns, heaven and hell. So it wasn't a main topic in most of their poetry and writing. And in fact, they made many statements that, according to actually traditional Islam and Orthodox Islam, that could have taken them to hell, but they still made them, and they didn't really care because they thought that the word that they were talking about had no actually association with any political or social movement, with three exceptions. We have three Sufi that were really executed. My personal impression is that they were executed because they had some issue with politics, and these three are Al-Hallaj, who was kind of supposedly an Ismaili also, and there were letters where he was calling his devotees to gather and to get together and to organize themselves. So Al-Hallaj is one, but he was executed supposedly because he said, "I'm the truth and there is nothing but God under the cape that I am wearing." Bayezid al-Bastami said more than that. Ibn Arabi said more than that. Ibn Sab'in said more than that, and they weren't executed. The second and the third are Sohrawardi وعين القضاة الحمداني, and those two were having some serious issue with the Seljuqid, I think, for عين القضاة. And I remember very well Sohrawardi also had another issue with some governing group at his time. So these are the three that they were executed, and I believe they were executed for political reason, not for religious or esoteric kind of language that they used. I don't think so, even though the three of them were executed supposedly for religious reason, but the three of them had some political activities. And this is what I mean by there is a line, there is a thin line. It's really blurred quite often when you are a Sufi, because when you start talking about God and the other world and other things, it's basically a philosophical statement, has nothing actual or factual. We call them Sufi, but in modern language they should be called philosophers, because that's what they were doing. And at that time their word did not include heaven and hell. And why I'm saying this now, and I will return to where I started, because Al Niffari really, in his search for kind of truth, did not mention like the reward for this kind of activity is heaven, or the punishment will be hell. Never, it was never mentioned that. It was even not even one of his topics, heaven and hell. Neither him nor the other one. And there was actually a tradition, again, that is attributed to Muhammad, where he said, and it looks like it's also attributed to John, where Muhammad says on behalf of God that I prepared for my people what they have never seen, what they never heard, and they will never be worried. So this word where nothing that had been seen, nothing, I mean, this goes beyond the description that we have of women and wine and rivers that we have sometimes. So Sufis really used this kind of comparison by saying that the word that they were really looking for doesn't include heaven. There is one other reason why heaven was not included. Heaven is basically another state in another world, supposedly for Muslims. No, the peak of what a Sufi can achieve is not something in another world. The peak of what a Sufi can achieve is extinction before God. So this state, he can achieve it down here, and that's where they were talking about most of the time. Hence, we understand why they never paid attention to the idea of heaven and hell, because really it doesn't answer their search. Their search ends up here. According to some Sufi, once you reach that point of extension before God, even the laws of Islam will not apply to you because you become God yourself. How can any law apply to you? Now, of course, Orthodox Muslim asked them this question, so they said that means there are no more rituals, you won't do anything, you won't pray, you won't do any pilgrimage, etc., etc. Sufis most of the time answer that when they are in that state, they are not supposed to follow or do any rituals. In other words, the Sufi thinks that his highest achievement is not heaven or hell. His highest achievement, if he can keep it, is that state of extension before God. And now we understand why heaven and hell did not make it. For most of the writings of Sufis, they never discussed it well. It was never really a major issue to them, and they worked toward achieving something else, which is the state of extinction. We will talk another time about the state of extinction when it comes to Al Niffari, because he didn't develop it well, and that's why I believe that for Al Niffari, truth is the veil. It's not something else, neither behind it, nor next to it, nor anywhere near it. The highest achievement for Al Niffari is really to be a veil and to lift the veil, because he himself is a veil. There is nothing else. And here we get back to the point where we started when we were talking about the simulacra. Yes, the simulacra is not only the evidence that shows that there is no truth or reality. Simulacra becomes itself the truth. And this is important. The veil is the truth according to Al Niffari. Thank you.